Welcome. As you know, this evening's talk is to be given by Dalibor Vesely, himself a very great friend and influence in the AA and its history of the last 20-odd years. And obviously, as you know, a great teacher both here and at Cambridge. I'm sure it's kind of redundant to almost everyone here to remind you that Dalibor studied art history and architecture and philosophy in Prague. And after leaving Czechoslovakia in 1968, and from then until 1978, he was a much admired diploma teacher at the AA. Subsequent to that, obviously, he moved to Cambridge, where he occupied much the same kind of position. He was there director of the graduate program in the history of philosophy of architecture, and evolved a kind of, not only a kind of distinctive program, but a distinctive way of approaching architecture. Since his kind of partial retirement from Cambridge, we've been extremely lucky that he returns to the AA, and we're even now kind of figuring a program that he's going to deliver at the AA next term. I would have wanted him to be a central figure in the diploma courses, but unfortunately in the autumn when we run them, he's already spoken for at Penn. Dalibor brings an enormous seriousness and humanity to the question of architecture, and those who've been taught by him kind of know in a kind of obscure way often. It's not so much that they take on each and every of his opinions, but to him we owe a sort of contemporary definition of a true teaching, of enabling a student to understand the seriousness of the cultural predicament they face. I can hear a certain kind of melancholy tone, involuntary, in my own voice, and it's really because of this that, as you yourselves will have seen, the powers that be, whether we locate that at the level of Cambridge University or at the level of the present government, or possibly as part of a kind of contemporary cultural drift. The school at Cambridge, with which the AA has had such close and amicable relations, not only with Dalibor, but obviously also with Peter Carl. For us to find that the school in Cambridge is in any way threatened is an intellectual and cultural outrage. And so I spoke to Dalibor just before he was going to start his lecture, and really invited him, since one knows as a teacher that whatever he was talking about, it would inevitably be inflected by a certain cultural and educational crisis, which is indexed by the problems facing the school at Cambridge. I'm sure you will forgive me in having asked him to say something very briefly before his lecture about the nature of the campaign to restore the school at Cambridge to its rightful position. It's then with a kind of redoubled solidarity and affection that I welcome Dalibor.
It's probably more of a coincidence that the scene in Cambridge and what I'm going to talk today about, to some extent, well, they don't coincide, but there is an affinity there. The title has been actually sort of introduced of the talk today before the last stage of the events in Cambridge. What it basically amounts to is not very difficult. Architecture is treated by the government as science, and the criteria are therefore pretty clearly defined as environmental science. Environmental science means a well-tempered environment or such a thing. And those criteria are used across the board, which means if you happen to do that, you don't have to even teach studio or anything else, you're okay. On the other hand, if you don't do that enough, you're not okay. And so the criteria gave the department, not our, but other departments, practically all of the departments related to universities in this country, ended up the same way as Cambridge. And that's not necessarily a surprise. You know, if you start sort of judging tailors by the way how they can make shoes, it's not going to be a terribly successful result. So fine, good luck. Anyway, the result simply is that you know, it's to do with measurements and what's going to be directly measured, what doesn't come into that framework of environmental science doesn't count. You may not believe it, but we have been still in the last stage, talking about 10 years ago, judged always on what we do in terms of teaching and what we do in terms of research. The teaching assessment seems to disappear, so we're not judged on that at all. You know, if you are brilliant or stupid, doesn't make any difference. It's not counting. What counts is the research, and research of certain kind. Even that term is a tricky one. You know, how much research goes into project, how much into different kind of investigation that you do in studio, etc., etc., etc. So anyway, as a result, we are simply not considered to be on that sort of level of expectations as government is concerned. Curiously enough, we are judged by criteria of science, but in the university we belong to the School of Humanities, which have much less money and much more pressed themselves than sciences, engineering, and all the rest. Well, I think that's just about enough. I think it doesn't matter what happens, people who want to do something will survive, and I think we have been doing it for quite a number of years. My kind of experience is pretty straightforward. I've been living for 20 years under whatever it's called, you know, the Eastern Europe regimes. And anything cultural was done illegally because of political reasons. We just basically continue doing it illegally for economic reasons. So the rules practically don't change. You know, you switch from one to another, and what you do is very much the same. You have to sort of sell it underground, so to speak, and be much more clever about it and much more tough, etc., etc. I suppose that's enough. The rest you can make up your mind about and whatever. But you know, situation may be different in 5, 10 years. What I'm doing and what I'm going to talk today about is not really history, philosophy, architecture per se. I'm interested in it only to the extent that it reflects on what we're doing. My primary concern, and 80% of my time is involved in design, studio design, starts there and finishes there. And if what the reflection brings in doesn't help you to design, forget it. Theory is, to me, particularly very awful term. I don't like it at all. But that's another story. So it's a question of reflection, reflecting on where we are, what we're doing, and because we haven't got much time when we're designing, and occasionally one has to stop and go in the corner or somewhere else and sit down maybe around a table with a few people and do some sort of thinking and try to kind of understand things which happen eventually in the treadmill of the office practice. The title, On the Crossroad, well, the crossroad has many kind of implications. We are on the crossroad, and you say, well, is it something new? Probably architecture has been on the crossroad for quite a time. That's true. It has been since, well, I don't know, at least 17th century probably. And the notion of architecture vis-à-vis the rest of culture begin to be first time questioned vis-à-vis territory that would come very close to architecture but was not exactly it, but would push, as it were, the line closer and closer to architecture itself. You may see it in different manifestations. There is no just one word to describe the crossroad, or eventually, tension, dilemma, conflict, whatever you like. So the names would be instrumental tendencies against communicative tendencies, natural science against humanities. In our world, it's projected very firmly and quite clearly in the, what shall we call it? I wouldn't call it conflict, because it's not really conflict, it's just ambiguity, and to some extent great confusion between architecture and engineering. And the state of affairs today that I referred to before is very much to do, has much to do with that among the people who are making decisions, the notion of architecture has never been very, very clearly understood. It looks like something which is affiliated to engineering, and maybe that it could be seen as applied engineering and basta. You know only well that in this country a number of architecture schools already been absorbed in the framework of engineering, and most of them you don't know more about at that point. They just vanish from the scene. Engineering schools, of course, would be still able to do things which we normally would consider to be of architectural nature, but the line is not very clear. And the tendency to slowly absorb the architectural territory into something much larger, which can be called either design or industrial design, but mostly kind of territory of engineering, is taking place only partly explicitly, but mostly implicitly, as it were, by small step, which we are not mostly aware of. What is interesting, and I'll stop commenting on that with this sentence, that all the intelligent engineers I know trying to move towards something which is closer to architecture. They try to understand the broad foundations of their own discipline and learn about things which are not normally part of the engineering curriculum. Paradoxically, there is a growing number of architects who are doing exactly the opposite. They seem to be meeting on the same staircase. And the architects sort of dream of being, as far as possible, equivalent at least to the engineer. I think the problem remains, but the implications of that are not academic and they are not just theoretical, philosophical. They are absolutely real, and some of them are actually fatal. Because engineering has its own possibilities, but has its own also limits. And the intelligent engineers do know that probably only too well, and they remind us as architects. I remember a conversation in this room about 15 years ago or something. Frank Newby and Peter Rice and those intelligent engineers that we admire, respect. And the rest of the room was full of architects. And the case for architecture was made, not so much by architects, but by the engineers themselves. That was quite sort of interesting and strange moment. What is, I think, most kind of actual about the notion of crossroad is that with the possibilities of extending the territory of instrumental thinking, technology, engineering in our case, is that the technology was addressing the sphere of unorganic sort of world, later on organic, and it's still sort of there in spheres of bioengineering, which is now becoming a very popular new subject in universities. But it reached already some years ago, decades probably, one can say, the territory of mentality, of human experience. So out of the unorganic organic comes the territory of human experience, which of course will be most explicitly represented by the current studies, research, and possibilities in artificial intelligence. And that actually is a fundamentally new stage, very different from the previous, because so far people would be still standing, as it were, in front of the possibilities of dealing with unorganic or organic nature. But once it comes to you, it comes from inside. And once you are absorbed in those possibilities, there is a very difficult kind of situation to see how much you absorbed, how much you are in charge, how much you control and how much you don't control that particular sphere of technological possibilities. And I think that's what's fundamentally new about the situation at the crossroad. And I would probably summarize it with one sentence that we hear quite often. It comes very often to the notion of virtual realities, this kind of broad framework in which a lot of simulations and possibilities go, cyberspace, etc., etc., etc. The virtual reality is very often defined as being more real than reality itself. Well, in one sense, it is true. But it's true only in terms of possibilities, but not necessarily in terms of actualities. And I would again finish the sentence saying, there is still a difference which cannot be ignored between possible realities that we can produce and simulate, etc., and real possibilities. So the line between possible reality and real possibility is something which should be understood and watched very, very closely, because that really is the source of confusion I mentioned earlier. I'll go straight into images now, and oh, that's the point. Right. Can we move something light, turn down the light? Is anybody in charge of switches? Anybody can turn the light? Thanks. This is probably just starting very much in the middle of things. The Gary operation has enormous influence, and not only in the profession, but also, and probably even more, in architectural schools, particularly when you are in States. Gary seems to be nowadays almost in every second medium-sized American city. If not now, it's expected to happen in the next 5 years. So the Gary world, I think, is quite indicative of something which we still don't know really how to respond. What is interesting about that is that you don't necessarily need to very often know what kind of building, in terms of purpose, you are in. There is certain similarities between the Guggenheim that everybody knows, but also the recently finished Disney in building in LA. And so it goes into other museums and buildings. It has a certain kind of self-sufficiency, and probably the best possible way to really understand what we're looking at is to see the merit, or question rather, of the aesthetic experience that it creates. The artist could create, and that is very much taken for granted as an assumption, like nature, because being a force of this creative nature, he possesses in his soul unconscious formative power, which enables him to identify himself with the formative energies of the world itself. The rather kind of unreal sense of the creative freedom may explain the ease with which the artists themselves see the possibility to create a completely new epoch and style of architecture from their own just personal resources without reference to anything much beyond. This culminates, of course, in Eisenman, who is making it into a program, totally decontextualized architecture. Fine. Now, what may appear as a purely utopian endeavor became possible in a culture where art is dominated, and architecture for that matter, by pure aesthetics, aestheticism in that. In such culture, the work of art is a world in itself, virtually removed from all connection with practical reality, and it is to be experienced only as a beautiful form. Through the purely aesthetic experience, the work of art loses its place in the world to which it belongs, and belongs only to aesthetic consciousness, the experience we have, fascination, excitement. You know, those are the terms we very often use, including our juries and crit. You don't say it's good, beautiful. You say it's exciting, or you say it's interesting to start with. It's very interesting. Doesn't matter what you look at sometimes. It's just interesting. But then it could be exciting. And when it's exciting, it really comes to the point where you really get excited, because it's just like, Rausch, kind of, euphoria. And I think at that point, our sensibility has very much now been situated. We are too bored with things which are just good or beautiful. We want something much more and much more interesting, hence also the novelty and all that goes with it. Now, through the purely aesthetic experience, the work of art loses the place in the world in which to which it belongs, and belongs only to aesthetic consciousness. On the other hand, this is paralleled by the artist also losing his place or her in the world. And then the aesthetic experience, in the aesthetic experience, nothing is known about the object which are judged as beautiful. We don't have to know much about it. It's just the effect, how it impresses us. The natural meaning of the object does not affect the essence of the aesthetic judgment. As a consequence, the work of art has nothing to do with truth. Why should we worry about that? The work is only a beautiful form, mere sort of reference to the possible variety of aesthetic experiences. Fair enough. The loss of the art and its place in the world is compensated by the self-sufficiency of the artist, who feels self-sufficient like a genius or little god. To be self-sufficient means, what does it mean? It means to be able to appropriate the whole of history and culture and make them part of one's own world, and to remain open to the unlimited inventiveness. In other words, to be a genuine or true genius. Was it always like that? Well, not probably. What we're dealing with is relatively very recent phenomenon. We're dealing with something which starts maybe 18, but goes through the 19th, 20th century. In the case of Gary, just to look at one thing, the pieces, as you probably know, are extremely sophisticated way put together. The studio, Gary's studio is Los Angeles, but the pieces are produced and prepared down to millimeter in Kansas City, where it's a very sophisticated, fully kind of automated, computerized factory. And I saw it just a few weeks ago. It's quite a miracle to watch. So you can practically make anything. They have no limit on shape, size. Well, the size is the limit, but you can go quite a long way. And the complexity of it is not a problem. Now, if you look at the structure and you look back at the building, you can spend quite a bit of time looking at the structure, how it's put together, how it all eventually may work as a piece, as a whole building. That sort of thing which becomes hidden in the final result. And you don't know about it, and you're not supposed to. In other words, there is a conceptual side to the operation. Incredibly sophisticated sweating goes into the technicality of the whole building. And quite impressive piece of engineering. But of course, engineering as a structure represents something which is also the conceptual strata or level, conceptual level of our culture itself, generally speaking. So the conceptual world is, as it were, one territory, almost, in this case, even geographically, physically, separated from the place where the project is put together in terms of models and the kind of preliminary sketches and the overall vision of the result. If you look at example, and I'm not spending any time on that, but just example, how it would be, similar situation, say, still in 17th century. Guarini is known of being one of the most sophisticated figure on the scene mathematician and theologian or whatever, but primarily figure that contributed to the foundation of modern projective geometry, which is one of the major steps to the modern geometries, leading to non-Euclidean, eventually to topologies, and the stuff that we're using today in our simulation, topological geometries. Now, he would do the structure in a way that represents, in essence, what is really essential about reality itself. That's why the structure is what it is. He starts and generates, and the generative notion, what generates building, the notion of generative architecture, which is so much used today as a term, is something which summarizes a large portion of reality, generally, although broadly at least, understood. It was not his fiction, it was not his, as it were, original step. It was understood. Summarize the culture. You can go on, for hours here talking about Trinity and blah, blah, blah. That was the church was supposed to be, and is in the end. It's Sindona in Torino, by the way. And from that is generated a plan, which you see down there. You see the geometry beginning to organize the plan. So you go from that 6 times, and you get the whole thing, and then you're working up. And eventually it ends up in that very provocative, unusual construction, which, looking at just aesthetically, we probably wouldn't go very far. It's sort of okay, but it's not terribly aesthetically exciting. It's much more provocative in terms of its complexity and being clever. Well, I have spent a few pages in the book on it, so if you're interested, you can read more about it. I'm not going to bore you with details here, but all I wanted to say is, and show with that example, of which there are many until 18th century, where the conceptual sphere, the complexity of thinking, would be translated in steps, in continuity, to the most tangible down-to-earth phenomena, like, the stone out of which the whole thing is made, and the floor, the ground, you name it, a lot. And the human beings as corporeal creatures situated in such a space. So that continuity of reference and communication is established. Situation changes quite dramatically when it comes to the late 17th century. And one thing which I think happens, and that's really the beginning of what I would see as the trend towards the crossroads on which we're going to be more and more and more challenged, questioned and challenged. Somebody who was talking about that particular period summarized the whole problem quite beautifully. Says, there is something to which Newton, or better to say, not Newton alone, but modern science in general, can still be made responsible. By the way, this is a painting called Apotheosis of Newton, and it's by Italian called Panini. Painting is in Fitzwilliam in Cambridge. Now, Newton alone, but modern science in general, can still be made responsible. It is a splitting of one world into two. He did this by substituting for our world of quality and sense, perception, the world in which we live, laugh, and die. Another world. The world of quantity, of reified geometry, a world in which, though there is a place for everything, there is necessarily not a place for man. This, the world of science, the real world, became estranged and utterly divorced from the world of the world of life, which science has been unable entirely to explain, not even to explain away by calling it just subjective and get rid of it. True, these worlds are every day and even more and more conceited by the praxis. Yet for theory, they are divided by an abyss. Two worlds, this means two truths, or no truth at all. This is the tragedy of modern life, which solved the riddle of the universe, but only to replace it by another riddle, the riddle of itself. So we are in that sort of predicament. The results of that would be, and I'm not spending much time, just two more examples. Ledoux puts that, and it's a very puzzling piece in his piece on architecture, treatise, very beautifully illustrated. He, as you know, probably made plans for the ideal city and the La Ville de Chaux in East France. And then he built a cemetery, and the entry to the cemetery, as you can see in the title, looks like that. Well, it doesn't look like architecture, does it? It doesn't look like a building or gate to the city, or anything like that. We can understand that because he sees now himself very much like already the master. He actually, in his treatise, which is quite amusing, calls himself to be not only genius, but be like a god. And then he says in final sentence, and probably what I do is like God creation, so I'm like God. Well, good luck. Given for one instant, a contemporary thinker brings it into line, and somebody that Ledu was very much aware of. He says more about this and gives us probably key to what's going on in the very provocative image. Given for one instant an intelligence which could comprehend all the forces by which nature is animated and the respective situation of the beings who compose it, an intelligence sufficiently vast to submit this data to analysis, it would embrace it in the same formula, the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the lightest atom, for it nothing would be uncertain, and the future as the past would be present to its eyes. The human mind offers in the perfection which it has been able to give to astronomy a feeble idea of this intelligence. Remember that when people talk today about the current possibilities, edge developments in science and technology in particular, and the artificial intelligence as an exemplary case, we talk about intelligence, intelligent buildings, intelligent spaces, intelligent possibilities of research, etc. Intelligence is very much in vogue. People use it left and right. Now, applying the same method to some other objects of knowledge, it has succeeded in referring to general law of observed phenomena and in foreseeing those which given circumstances ought to produce. All these efforts in the search for truth tends to lead it back continually to the vast intelligence which we have just mentioned. But we already partly appropriated, so we have it. Certainly the modern notion would be there. And I finish just with some wonderful sort of statement that made by Descartes himself, foundation of the Cartesian tendency of thinking, which we are still part of. Computers are based basically on Cartesian principles. He says, for a short time, therefore, allow your thought to leave this world in order to come to see a wholly new one, which I shall cause to be born in the presence of your thought in imaginary spaces. Well, that's a nutshell, almost, definition or anticipation of virtual reality. I can cause it, I can create it. Where? Here, in my head. Now, he says also that the discipline that will do it will be universal, and it will be universal natural science, based basically on the astronomical principles that we see here. It will be a productive science, motivated by an ambition to be nothing less than creation from zero, from nothing. Fair enough. What is interesting is that the Crossroad, or the divided, I call it in title of my book, divided representation, the two worlds, two scenes, represented by two different attitude, approaches, and way of thinking, would be complemented. The Laplacian vision, the objectivity, the anonymity of the order that we can appropriate as intelligence, would be complemented by the romantic position. And the romantic position, of course, would be summarized by the utmost definition or reference to one's own personality, me, my dreams in relation to the rest, without any kind of interference. There is nothing between me and the world in its primary existence, the most given, call it nature or natural world. No culture, no history, no other people interfering, etc. Just eventually me. This dilemma or duality obviously represents two territories which will be cultivated. Poetry, literature, music, arts, partly architecture, etc. would be living, as it were, in its own territory, and the area of science and its application, engineering, etc., would be living in its other territories. On occasion, of course, they communicate and meet, but in the end, it doesn't change the fact that there are two cultures, really, that we are in. What is in between? Well, There's no way to describe it. I use the term gray zone of modernity has been created. And mostly, we're operating, without being necessarily conscious of it, we are operating in the gray zone, particularly as architects. Architects are situated right in the middle of it. We still feel that there is something to do with our work, has to do with imagination, and a certain amount of spontaneity, creativity, and so on. And yet, we sort of cannot ignore the fact that we're working with highly precisely defined means of material structures and technological possibilities, etc., etc. That's more or less what you can see as a kind of almost like a manifestation in the work of Sharon on one side and his Philharmonia I'm using as an example, in contrast to Mies. And they all meet, strangely enough, in one place, which I think is very telling. It's Berlin. We are close to the old wall. The wall would be sort of doing this. And Sharon is, of course, here. They produced the chamber after his death, music, concert hall, Mies. Sharon did also the library. And if you are interested, this bit is Sterling, this Science Institute, Research Institute in Berlin. Now, it's interesting to see what those two gentlemen have to say. Sharon would say, the individual, sorry, before we go, it's Mies. The individual is losing significance, and his destiny is no longer what interests us. We are just interested in the anonymity of the work we do and its perfection. In contrast, Sharon says, do we reach pure creativity through reflection or through knowledge? No. Man is the center. So here you have these two positions expressed very clearly in that quote. If you go one step further, one can illustrate the problem very, very beautifully. How these two, as it were, define the gray zone being, as I said, in between those two extremes. Eiffel Tower, which was built 1899, was obviously a miracle of engineering and still is probably to be respected, admired. It's a wonderful piece. And yet, the culture completely dismissed it. The most intelligent people wrote protests. It was just simply not part of Paris. It was supposed to be taken down immediately after the exhibition, etc., etc. So, total negation, refusal, nothing to do with the rest of the world. Isolated object, end of conversation. Well, in a few decades, particularly now in the recent time, well, if you refer to Eiffel Tower, it's not structure. For most people, it's a symbol. Symbol of Paris, symbol of France, French culture, etc., etc. How it all happened? Well, it happened by bridging the gap between those two worlds through media that mostly the arts would provide. Paintings would be made of tower, music would be composed, it would appear on the stage set, in stage set, and so on, and so on, and so on. One example that would summarize the rest is Delaunay, who did himself series of quasi kind of cubist painting of the tower. And you can see probably in his way of thinking how it gradually brings it into the surrounding, how it makes it part of the Parisian setting, takes it into elements which can be seen as certain association, affinities, and so on, and gradually integrates it with that. But it's a task. It's not something which can be taken as given. It's also interesting in the work of people that I know quite well. Danny Libeskind is a very good example of those two worlds. He's one of the most probably well-read, intelligent, almost philosophical mind, and great sense of music, poetry, and all the world. But that's his private world very much. How it comes to his building is another story altogether. It's done by, as you probably know, usually in collaboration with some of the better engineers, with sophisticated approach, rather original, unusual approach to engineering. You know, this would be done with Arab engineering department and so forth. Very sophisticated world. And yet, this would be the private world. It's called the shadow of an architect. Those things are usually not very often published, but you see some of them at least. He's got a large body of drawings which he keeps very much to himself. You can go one step further still, and this is territory which I think touches on our present state of duality, ambiguity, and really brings us very much on the current, up-to-date version of the Crossroads. Peter Eisenman. Well, Eisenman spent a little bit of time in Cambridge as well, and he was very much involved with the group that would be doing the kind of mathematical modeling at that time. That background probably explains quite a bit. That's part of his way of thinking still today. He looks at Piranesi, which is probably one of the, again, first attempt to see the problem of architecture in city, on a city scale, as a purely kind of conceptual operation. Forget what's happening on the ground, forget about archaeology and all kind of evidence, just make the city as I would like to see it. So the kind of idealized vision of Rome. This is this famous piece of his Roman reconstructions. That's not interesting in itself, but what is interesting is what Eisenman takes from it. The Campo Marzio is obviously the name of the reconstructions. He says, it's a fascinating page. Urban competition in Berlin, 1995. The project stems from the relationship between different figures, in this case, the mechanism of a clock and a microchip change by morphing. No figure dominates the other, and these diagrams reveal a new intervention strategy for the city. Now, this is interesting as an operational kind of achievement, but operation in the sphere of representation. You represent practically everything that is going on here is not so much a matter of a dialogue, it's a matter of a monologue. And I would call it not creative yet at this stage, it's a productive dialogue. You're producing a possibility how a structure can be derived from a conceptual model, or even more precisely from conceptual operations. Those operations usually take place in front of a computer, but it goes into models, goes into final model, and something which may be seen as a step towards its realization. If you look at some other pieces, it obviously leads to a production of building, high-rise, in this case again, competition in Berlin, where all you can say about it is just what you know. And you happen to know the brief. The brief would obviously have something to do with the requirements inside and so forth, but tell you nothing about the way how the requirements should be met. And as you go through it and you compare it with the brief, you will discover more and more that in fact the brief is only a point of departure and another excuse, where in fact the configuration of the building very often deliberately goes across the requirements of the brief. And it's its own presence, its own kind of autonomy, independence. And the only way you can judge it would be very similar to what we said about Gary, that you forget about the content because it doesn't take you very far. And you're looking at the sheer configuration, the shaping of the piece. You're almost living in a sculpture. It's quite amusing that, just a few weeks ago I was passing by in New York the Cooper Union building, and next to it, Charles Gwathmey is just finishing a residential high-rise, 36 floor high, luxury flats. We are on the 14th Street and Broadway, so very much in the center of New York. And it's advertised as luxury purpose-built flats, price 1.5 to 3.5 million each. So that gives you, the level on which it is expected to the clients. And the most important thing is, and accept the possibility of having a fascinating life living in a sculpture. So I remember sort of looking at it twice, looking at the building, back at the sculpture, and I wasn't entirely disappointed. It was a sculpture, very much, piece. And it has a sort of very, very interesting sort of relation again between, inside the core of it, because as it happens, and it's quite wonderful, half of it is still as a frame, and the lower one is already finished. And the curtain wall is doing very much the kind of little moves, miracles, as the fault of Eisenman. Just to remember, what we get in interiors. This goes back to his Ohio museum, and one of the most interesting, from this investigation that goes on computer, to a much more interesting, consistent process when it goes to making quite an ambitious project, building of a church. The model helps to see in advance, to follow the evolution of the building to be constructed. During the design phase, the models, diagrams, and computer models intercommunicate. Each is inserted in a specific phase and affects the other, enriching it with new perspectives and figurative and conceptual possibilities. The diagrammatic models become a theoretical reflection on the project and give it form. Now, the key to that, at the beginning and the end, and that's what Eisenman is very, very proud of, is that he can really derive it from a diagram. It's a very different kind of diagram. The geometry we saw, for instance, in Guarini, or we would find in other more kind of integrated buildings. It's a separate. The diagram now is a magic key, almost like a paradigm, to all the rest that happens. Then, that would decide the shape of the model, but the model would be very quickly put into computer, and the computer would take it as far as possible in terms of variations and creative, well, productive, in this case, possibilities. As you can see on those, the sequence, the series of the diagrammatic model, they are all diagrammatic because they are derived from the primary diagram. Fine. The result would be this. We cannot ask questions about physiognomy. This is all, just related directly to the appearance of the particular piece, which is unique and supposed to be. We cannot really take the physiognomy into the level of orientation, how we go around. And then comes the question of topography. And we saw how the problem of topography was treated and how it can be absorbed in the process when we look at the Klinenberg competition project. I think it becomes much clearer when you look at his more prosaic project. This is the interchange. Basically, it's about transport on Staten Island. You're facing back to the tip of Manhattan. The sequence of movement is apparently the section, and that more or less takes you, from one end to another. At certain point, you would go into the other sort of system of transport. So, it's a cross station. Eventually, the whole thing has something to do, probably in this case, with the kind of engineering vision of dealing with flow of movement and what can happen in the points of interchange. But it's an engineering task, no doubt about it, which is then modulated into a possibilities of a kind of unique sense of particular place where you are. The uniqueness is obviously in this case good or problematic at the same time. We don't have a one word to answer it. It's ambiguous. It remains so. This is just to complete the conversation, is the submission for the Zero Ground in New York. Eisenman, Richard Meyer, and Steve Hall. What is, I think, interesting now is more the influence, because we're talking about sphere of influence. You're not talking about, people working in STEAM competitions and so on. We're talking about the sphere of influence that goes through publications and goes through schools and so on. And on that level, some of the possibilities that will be still to some extent intellectually, as it were, coherent and probably in very intelligent way presented, certainly. When it comes to the territories that are beyond that sort of sphere of intellectual integrity, it seems to produce things which are probably just open to sheer possibilities. I'm hesitating to use the term arbitrary, but you are on that. The notion of arbitrary and original and individual are almost interchangeable. You are very much on a kind of boundary here. And it's sort of very exciting, but at the same time, very sort of mind-boggling. You know, why? What would be the next step? This is a Parmentier and group of digital studios called, and the project Temporary Structure Exhibition Information Center at the end of Wall Street, east end of Wall Street, which eventually comes out like that, a bit of a tube that you go through, and you get the information that otherwise probably we are familiar with in terms of multimedia and so on and so forth. Possibility how you can interpret some of the conceptual issues recently very much on the scene, like fold. That's Diller Scofidio studio. They are at the moment really very influential in the east coast of states, Princeton, New York, and so on. This is a building, Technological Art and Technology Institute, which is under construction in New York. Interiors, smoothly flowing spaces, more or less everything you've seen in terms of change and possibilities of invisible almost, or imperceptible transformations. You are, as it were, in a kind of dream world of a sort. Probably one of the most kind of provocative was a project in 2002, I think it was, in Switzerland on the Lake Neuchâtel. A building which practically would disappear in a cloud and would be identified with a cloud, and shape of cloud and shape of the building, the transitoriness of the cloud movement would be the goal. Those things are, of course, as you can see, the platform has all the spouts and steams coming in, and it can be partly controlled with computer and so on. But it creates a shape that you can, to some extent, influence. And in it would be a notion of imaginary habitation as a possibility. So here we are with that possibility. The notion of media and change brings actually the way of thinking very much together into kind of one point. The sheer sort of transitoriness, temporary kind of gestures, almost like installation. And it's sort of interesting to see, well, how much you can extend that particular way of thinking into other territories of the architectural jobs, tasks, requirements, and so on and so forth. I'm finishing rather with that. This is a totally imaginary project for somebody called Sergio, and it's a project for London, and it's imaginary. It's a notion of, well, it's a scenario which takes a meteorite falling down in London, as you can tell in the background, a bit of a reference, falling down the ground and creating a big hole in which all the arts, museum, and events can be created as a kind of better version of what the South Bank stands for. We are obviously touching now on territory that, in one word, I would describe not as just virtual reality, but as a reality, as an architecture of telepresence. The business of telepresence is very much in vogue in some territories of US. The people of studying artificial intelligence are involved, but also people who operate straight from the heart of architecture. MIT, very much, Bill Mitchell, now head of it, is very much promoting that. The notion of telepresence, perhaps you're familiar or not, but it's quite useful to refresh our memory what the telepresence really stands for, and we probably would be better off looking at example. The MIT people would say and claim that we are definitely entering an era of electronically extended bodies, living at the intersection points of the physical and virtual worlds of occupation and interaction through telepresence as well as through physical presence of mutant architectural forms that emerge from the telecommunications, induced fragmentation and recombination of traditional architectural types and of new soft cities that parallel, complement, and sometimes compete with our existing urban concentration of brick, concrete, steel, etc., etc., etc. I'm cutting a little bit what I wanted to say, but I'm hopefully delivering the point as we go. What we're dealing here with is the two worlds. We still have to remember that we are still in two worlds. because even the most dematerialized, the most conceptually advanced virtual space is a space that somebody put together, somebody created, and somebody is then experiencing it. And I think that's something which has been very often described as black market with experience. We believe that what we're doing, what is in front of us as representation, is the reality itself. That's, the belief of people who are involved directly. But of course, the people involved are involved as such, not just with their conceptual abilities or their heads, but also with their bodies. And that, of course, in a nutshell, brings together those two worlds. How they meet is always very interesting, curious, and provocative, because to bridge the gray zone is not a simple task. Shortcuts don't count. And you can see it when you look in real terms what happens when those two worlds do come together. They've been coming together already from 19th century onwards. The railway is a perfect system which is calculated down to minutes, precision. It works just like a clock. And yet its reconciliation, its bringing it together into one piece with the city has been always a perfect headache and still is. And I've seen dozens and dozens of student projects trying to see what can you do underneath, around, how can you make still one piece out of those two separate worlds. You can do it by forcing it a little bit, and people have been trying to do that in a very amusing way. 1890s already in France, a lot of projects where the railway would practically represent the city. You had the railway tracks at the top, you travel through the landscape, and underneath you can have practically all you need. So it appears for residential industries, you name it, the lot that you need basically for sustenance of life. Similar situation appears in some of the 20th century projects. Corp projects for South America and eventually for Algiers has something very similar in mind. But of course that's a dream which has to be understood in terms of its implications. How far you can really bridge the gap between clearly defined system, call it whatever you like, transport or whatever, and the full complexity of life that goes with it. I think that becomes very apparent, and I'm using one example to show it in stages. When you look at work of somebody like Calatrava, who I think covers more broader spectrum as an engineer, from this end that is, than any other engineer I know of today. He does beautiful work in the straightforward tasks like transport. His suburban railway station in Zurich is a pretty impressive piece of engineering, which to some extent also integrates even elements of architecture, but in a very limited way. His project for Berlin, the Reichstag, again, very plausible. Now, the market halls in Spain, interesting. Then he goes into town hall, and the town hall becomes interesting limit almost. And the limit can be understood. I mean, he does things like concert halls and so on, where there is a lot of questions asked. I mean, can you really extend that particular approach that far? Are you bridging the gap with the cultural requirements too quickly or not really taking into account fully the implication, the richness of the task? It comes out from his way of thinking. He would eventually, he does believe that everything that happens in his structure, in his buildings eventually, is practically to do with human body, and the rest is derived from it. And this sketch of his illustrated, I think, very well. The structure are just like arms and muscles and so on. Well, it's very difficult to imagine that, with just that, you can really grasp things which are beyond the somatic body, which has to do with body in terms of its animation and imagination, and what we represent as existence, as human existence is. So we are back again in a circle to the initial notion of aesthetic. And I would like to make a distinction between aesthetics and poetics. Poetics requires articulation. If you read a piece of text, you want to know what you're reading. If you're just fascinated by the sheer beauty of the language, which you don't even sometimes need to understand. Italian sounds fantastic. You don't have to understand it. French, pretty okay too, and so it goes. And certain visual poetry, just nice kind of configuration, collages, text, and so forth, prima. But you're necessarily not interested in what is in it. It's an interesting point. Fernand Léger, when he came first time to New York, he ended up in Times Square, and he was absolutely spellbound by the sheer beauty of the display of the neon lights and everything. He says in his diary, I spent half an hour just watching that theater. It was beautiful. And I felt that it's beautiful until I came close to realize that most of it is about advertisement of a toothpaste. And that was a setback. So the content, the poetry of it, contrasts here very clearly with the aesthetics of it. The sheer aesthetic, fair enough. The problem certainly is what happens when, with these possibilities, and I would see it as possibilities, not necessarily critical, just open-minded, there are possibilities. But can you now extend that particular way of thinking that we followed so far, telepresence, simulations, into two territories. One is embodiment, the corporeality, and the second is the territory of complexity. The complexity as it is given is something we cannot change. What do you do with that world? Real and the outskirts. It's very difficult to use sort of negative terms here. The paradox is that as it is already in existence for a number of decades now, the favelas, that is, what you see in front, is working up to a point very well. The kind of complexity of life, the music, relationship, neighborhoods, even small cottage industry, God knows what, against this background, which is much more obviously ambitious and much more expensive to live in, etc., but rather sterile by comparison. So these are kind of paradoxes. What do you do with that? Well, the paradox is that it is that particular kind of dilemma that is now going through the rest of the world, particularly in places like China and Far East, and to some extent Africa. Shanghai, well, you start from that. What do you do? You can either modify, transform, make something out of that as it is, or you just get rid of it. The engineering thinking decides otherwise, and that's where we are. You end up that sort of way. Is there a solution? Well, it is a solution, but basically by a shortcut. You're ignoring what is given, that there is a culture, there is a kind of existence, embodiment, corporeality, topography of a place. You can go on and on and on. That's just givens. You cannot ignore it. But you can. In a project like that, you just say, forget it. All can be interiorized. Instead all that, you can have your memories, videos, media that will tell you about it. You don't have to have that anymore. You can just have it in form of representation. It's interesting, how much some of the dreams, very personal, very individual dreams, this is Leonidov, believe it or not, how his vision would eventually influence, as a vision, as a kind of very subjective, dreamlike sort of vision, would move imperceptibly to the other end and turn into engineering enterprise, distant, laconic, detached. Well, this is still under construction happening in Shanghai, and you cannot ignore the affinity with Las Vegas and so on. Why? Why to bother? You have also solutions that you're of course very, very familiar with. This would be the 20s and 30s that established all that you can do in cities in modern terms. Paradigm that has been imitated ad infinitum right across the world. Hilbesheimer in Germany. That resolved the problem by basically reducing it all to kind of engineering equation. Or you have a complement to it, but probably the result is not much more different. Here is all the multitude of solitudes, private wells, so the subjectivity in multiple numbers practically produce the same result. So we are only curious sort of situation where the two extremes somehow meet and create almost one kind of problem. French have a different version, compromise. So that's a kind of one of the new towns. You look at the bag and say, well, maybe it's too grid-like, we can give it a shape, and aesthetically we can improve it. So good luck to aesthetics. That's what you end up with. the curved version of the grid. Or you can sort of treat it simultaneously. You can treat the engineering world. That's Jonas Friedman. When I started teaching here, people like Fuller and Jonas Friedman and co. were very, very, very much gurus for certain people, not for the whole school, but for some people. And Jonas Friedman was giving lectures just in this place many times about his transformation of Paris, and that's what you're looking at. You can't deal very much with all this mess on the ground. It's just so complicated. There's no room for new buildings anyway. So what you do is just bring it down on pilotis and build a city above it and leave the rest, to its fate. Or eventually maybe establish some communication, but that was not really on cards. Another way is to resolve it by putting it under. The underground city has been around for quite a bit. People don't talk about it anymore now, but used to, 60s, 70s, 80s. So the traffic, not only traffic, but department stores and a lot of public spaces can be buried underneath the Seine, the river. And Seine is long enough, as it goes to Paris, it winds. So you can store in it quite a chunk of Paris. Or in England, the very, the Motopia or Motoria project, just to bring all the traffic on the roof, roundabouts including, and the rest, 6 floors underneath. Fantastic living because you're facing the park. Good luck to you. Now, it's good to keep the dialogue going. We have been very much into monologues of the engineering dreams, monologue of the introverted romantic dreams. And the world somehow seemed to be always in the middle, in the gray zone. The complexity of the cities that we still go to and spontaneously find okay to do our things and spend a few days and so on, like Rome, Paris, etc., you name it, Brussels, Amsterdam, etc., London, New York. There is a kind of complexity on the ground that can be understood only in terms of continuous dialogue between the more kind of sophisticated level of culture, literature, sciences, philosophies, you name it, music, down to the concreteness of the ground, where you have your sandwich, coffee, glass of wine, relationship, friends, you name it. So it's good to kind of just briefly refresh our memory with that world. And I would use one kind of answer to that, key. Many other examples reduced to one. How we can really appreciate, understand what we're dealing with, and what is problematic about the split, the gray zone, is the lack of communication and lack of continuities and problems when we are supposed to correspond or respond to both ends simultaneously. Not only what you construct, but also how you live in it. What is to do with your dreams, with your memory, with your concreteness of the private life, etc., friendships again. Now, this particular link is a bit of an enigma. We still find it difficult. So, as a result, people either situate themselves on one end, on the other end. The key to that relationship is what I would describe as articulation and embodiment. We can articulate things quite a long way, but we still need some kind of an embodiment. When we think, we draw or write notes, we need some kind of embodiment. Don't keep it all in your mind. This eventually becomes part of it, maybe a little publication or something, book. The book is situated somewhere, and so it goes, so it goes. So the reciprocity of embodiment and articulation is a fascinating problem and key to what I would like to say in the few remaining minutes. The first step is a business, the most articulated is physiognomy. You try to recognize somebody or something drawing, and you have to kind of look at it in particular orientation. If you look at it upside down, it's not very clear what you're looking at. Anything to recognize, anything from people to things to drawings, you name it. Including, of course, the stuff that we're producing on our computers. It's a physiognomy. If you can't read it, if you can't understand it, you have to find a way to do it. Physiognomy is related to orientation and depends on it. But orientation also depends eventually on topography and depends on it. You can test it, if you like, in a very beautiful way. If you go to a beach and you're meeting somebody, supposed to meet somebody there, and the people sort of are in the wrong way, so you're coming from their head, you have to turn each time in order to recognize a particular face. And it's quite crazy. In particular angle, just clicks, and you recognize the physiognomy. people upside down look funny, especially when they start speaking. And you know that. So without orientation, there's a problem with physiognomy. But again, you have to be in particular position, topography, in order to have orientation. I give you one example, which is beautiful. It's from Zero Gravity, and the people are not psychologists or philosophers, they are scientists. And in their statement, what comes out of it is just stop, just precise sort of answer to what I'm trying to say in too many words. This world is obviously the territory where they do experiments and so forth. But when they sit and when they have few minutes for meal and meeting, that's what it is like. And I have to find the right pages. Okay, here we go. This is nothing but just straight statement they made about the situation in the zero gravity, which, just to remind you, would illustrate the link between physiognomy, orientation, and topography, something which we as architects should be very conscious of. He says, one of the members of the team in the space station, well, let's go back to, I think, situation more like that, describes an attempt to respond to the sound of the telephone in the darkness of the night. The Houston Center kept them in peace, but there was some emergency. They had to call them when they slept. So now, dark, night, sleeping bag, hanging on the wall. Quote, I had no way to determining up from down. I had no visual reference in the dark. I had to turn on the light, but I just did not know what direction to put my hand in. No orientation. So I had to feel things to orient myself. And now comes the interesting one. I had to use touch instead of sight, but everything felt different because I did not know my relationship to them. So even when I touched the telephone, I still could not figure out what shape I'm touching. There's something which you're not normally aware, which is normal situation, don't think of it. So things, as you touch, will be different. I know that this is up because, the rest is here, and I'm background to reading it straight like that. But if I am upside down, this probably will be different. A lot of things, everything will be different. So the orientation is a key to physiognomy. Now, one more. The importance of natural primary orientation was expressed very often in the following words. Quote, you tend to orient yourself when you are in a room, even though you are in zero gravity. And when you orient yourself, you should find everything is the same. You don't like something up and something under. You like things to be orderly, like they always are on Earth. So there is a certain kind of primary experience, familiarity, which you take for granted, which we don't have to rediscover or reconstitute, just simply there, available to us all the time. That's exactly what is missing in that situation. Most of the members of the team turn out to be so reluctant to give up the idea of a single vertical, such as they had enjoyed on Earth, that the designers despaired of the more ambitious plans. They hated, by the way, this module, when everything is sort of 360 degrees, and insisted to eat like that, which needs twice as much effort as it would be otherwise. You have to fix yourself to the ground before you start eating, because otherwise, if you pick up anything on the table, you start flying in air, rotating in zero gravity. So you have to be fixed very carefully. You're sitting like they're looking at each other, but in fact you can be sitting, one of you could be sitting on the ceiling, one on the wall, one on whatever, it doesn't matter. Yet they would refuse that. They had about an hour a day free with their chocolate, whatever they get in that. And there was one round window in the whole bloody thing. And they've been sort of competing how many minutes would be sitting there in the window looking down to Earth. Why to bother? It's all so nice to be, free in zero gravity. Now, in another statement it says, it is as though your mind won't recognize the situation you are in until it seizes pretty close to the right orientation, and then all of a sudden you get these transformations made in your mind that tell you exactly where you are. So it's not an easy, it's a very dense sort of statement, but tells us something about the need to take into consideration the business of embodiment, the background. In other words, I would put it into one sentence: the conditionality of all the wonderful imaginary things we can do in terms of concepts, in terms of possible realities, etc. That's all wonderful. But it's only one side of the story. The second are the conditions under which it becomes sustainable. And that's more or less what I'm trying to deliver as a message. This is very, very brief illustration just of the point. If you try to think, if you play any kind of ball game, ball games are a particularly good example, any ball game, anyone, basketball or whatever, and you think about it, what you're doing is unbelievably complex. You're moving, you're throwing the ball, the people moving, you make sure that the person in particular moment will get it, not now, but will in a few seconds, that it comes all in place. That's really the art of the play. If you can do it, you're winning. Now, what happens with the space here, the complexity of space? How it is possible? It is possible because underneath your feet you have the playground, and you're still situated in it. When you lose the sense of the playground, everybody would move, just like idiots, in all possible directions, and no game. The game has minimum, people call it rules. Forget about rules. There are conditions under which to play, because you're playing it back and forward. You play against the restrictions to the freedom, restrictions and freedom. You would not have freedom if you didn't have the restrictions, the conditions. Without that, it's just all mess. And ignoring just what we said now, ignoring the relationship and ignoring the implications of the conditions under which we operate, that we have memories, that we have bodies, that we live in a given world which you cannot change because the season's coming like it or not. There's no way to get rid of spring unless some cosmic catastrophe and so on. All that is here. To the extent that you're ignoring it, you're moving towards primitivism. That would be my argument. And the primitivism has become a very dominating topic on the 20th century scene. Primitive art, inspiration, of course, you know, in Cubism, Fauvism, and all the rest, fine. What is interesting about the primitive and primitivism, rather than primitive, the primitivism is an attempt to come to terms with this crazy situation where we cannot very easily understand, you know, how certain philosophical ideas, mathematics, conceptual kind of culture relates to where we are. Money and you know, exchange rates and all this economic structure, how it relates to our friendship. Because of that, we're moving either way, you know, just forget one side. But those are short-term answers, shorthand, I would say, shortcuts. People who try to resolve it would move from a very sophisticated speak or operate from a very sophisticated position and try to, as it were, live in the end and create on the other side. So primitivism is a much more interesting thing than primitive. Primitive, third world people and so on, as we call them, are not in fact primitive at all. They are very sophisticated. So primitive is very much, to the extent that you're leaving behind history, memory, culture, traditions, and all the rest, to that extent, you're moving into primitivism. Clare is a very good example of what I just said. Clare makes it very clear, he's not painting children, he would like to paint like child. That's his goal. And he says this very beautifully. He says this in one of the very short comments, quite clearly. He says, to proceed outward from within shows that primitivism is not a return to origins, but an attempt to be original, to be the origins. Clare speaks, quote, I want to be as though newborn, knowing nothing about Europe, knowing no pictures, entirely without impulse, almost in an original state. One wanted to seize life at its lowest levels, at its origins. Now this tendency can be summarized by a typical expressionist eventually statement, to reach the secret place where primeval power natures all evolutions. And I think I've got the image of that eventually somewhere. Anyway, I'll show it later. Clare again, just to finish, says, quote, if my pictures sometimes make a primitive impression, Clare was that one, make a primitive impression, it is because of my discipline in reducing everything to a few steps. It is only economy, or if you like, the highest professional sensitivity. In fact, the precise opposite of the primitive. So it's a sophisticated version of moving to the side of the personal, introverted, communicative culture. How they responded to it, one of the expressionist painters called Nolde, everything becomes eventually one thing. You know, the clouds, the material, the trees, water, air, everything becomes sort of one medium. And, you know, it's sort of come as close to identify oneself almost with those primary forces. It appears again in certain tendencies in current ecology, but I'm leaving that out. When he would look at art, primitive art, he would make his own art out of it. He doesn't want to imitate, he wants to make it his own. But this is primitive art from Korea, this is a mask from Benin, and he brings it together. The return to the origin, of course, is in that kind of romantic drawing visible. Claire eventually comes as a summary to the point where all can happen just from those most elementary things. Surrealism, of course, speaks about it very, very consistently. And architecture, Friedrich Kiesler, very much now, particularly in States, there is a kind of terrible revival of Kiesler work. And his, as you know, architecture was practically focused again and again and again on the notion of the primeval kind of egg as a kind of source of every other possible shape. Generative principle. I'm thinking here, of course, of some of the tendencies today, but to my astonishment, people read again Darcy Thompson and believe, you know, that there's some mystery in the natural forms of spirals and shells and all the rest. And it's part of the general kind of notion of generic architecture. You know, we are back to that particular dream, which is, of course, primitive, no doubt about it, absolutely primitive. I mean, Kiesler, that's inside of one of his models. The surrealists I'm leaving out, a kind of wonderful story, but let's leave it out. I'm rather looking at stuff like that which interests me. There are drawings done by people like Sharon, in this case the Sharon, sketches, visions. And we're dealing with that. Neo-expressionism. Interesting that even Malevich, who was a pretty sophisticated painter, would say about this painting, my abstract element on my canvases are just like tattoo on the body of the Aborigines. You can make up your mind about it. Why he says that, I don't know. And yet, of course, he would express his sophistication by admiration of the world that goes, you know, through early decades of American architecture. We are now moving into different kind of primitivism which appears on the surface neutral. And you know the work, we don't have to go through that, Denver projects. And what is fascinating about that notion of primitivism is the return to the primeval primary kind of forces which you can appropriate and become practically the universal creator. And that way you believe that you resolve the dilemma, that you become both, potentially, artist and engineer, architect and that, or anything for that matter in the world. The universality of that has been surprisingly, again and again through the 20th century, associated with the symbolic image, or paradigm almost, of a crystal. The crystal appears in so many forms, and just few examples. That's Paul Cerisier, painter who worked with Gauguin, member of the group Nabi. It's called the wisdom of the cosmos. The crystals would be very much on agenda in the Art Nouveau period. Then he goes through the expressionists, look hard. It appears in Mies. And look at the plan, crystal. And Breton, who focuses on crystal. Now, I got one or two little comments on that, which I think would be worth mentioning. Crystal, where are you? Oh, yes. Yeah, here we go. It's quite interesting to see how much the 20th century, and still probably our time, were influenced by the romantic and symbolist notion of creativity manifested in the paradigm of the crystal. Following an idealistic vision of creativity, the Viennese art historian already, Riegel, says, all artistic creation is thus essentially nothing other than a competition with nature, and the fundamental law according to which nature forms dead matter is that of crystallization. So crystallization is seen as a cosmic principle which brings together nature and art. It's interesting also Ozan Fan, who was a collaborator of Corp and founder of the Esprit Nouveau, one of the most probably influential magazine in the 20s and 30s. He says, on the whole, and in spite of personal coefficients, one can detect a tendency which might be described metaphorically as a tendency toward the crystal. The crystal in nature is one of the phenomena that touch us most because it clearly exemplifies its movement towards geometrical organization. Nature sometimes reveals to us how its forms are built up by the interplay of internal and external forces. The crystal grows and stops growing in accordance with the theoretical forms of geometry. Man takes delight in these forms because he finds in them what seem to be a confirmation for his abstract geometrical concept. You remember that that was written very much in time of the flourishing of non-figurative art, Kandinsky, Klee, Malevich, Mondrian, and so on and so forth. They all would subscribe to that. Nature and the human mind find common ground in the crystal as they do in the cell, and as they do wherever order is so perceptible to the human senses that it confirms those laws which human reason loves to propound in order to explain nature. In genuine cubism, there is something organic which proceeds outwards from within, like a crystal. And so it goes, so it goes. Well, Breton, and maybe that would be the, just one line from Breton, he says something very interesting and similar. The ultimate goal of the Surrealists was, of course, the understanding the mystery of creativity in its depth. The great secret, Breton says, of the environment of things and of our own freedom in relation to these things can be discovered in this way. The crystal possesses the key to every liberty. Paradoxical statement. Geometry, configuration, determinism, liberty. But it illustrates the desperate attempt somehow to survive in the gray zone, how the culture, highly conceptualized, can eventually be reconciled with the way we imagine, dream, and create. Now, from now, we can practically go without words. One of the kind of manifestation of it was the famous building by Bruno Taut, 1914 exhibition, glass, completely glass structure. And what he says is probably self-explanatory. But for the most part, in enclosed spaces, this form, for the most part, milieu in which our culture develops. Our culture is, so to speak, a product of architecture. Should we wish to lift our culture to a higher level, then we are obliged, for better or worse, to transform our architecture. We shall only succeed in doing this when we remove the element of enclosure from the rooms in which we live. We can only do this, however, with glass, which allows the light of the sun, moon, stars to enter not merely through a few windows set in the wall, but through as many walls as possible, walls of colored glass. The new milieu created in this way must bring us a new culture. Well, we can start from that and probably understand quite a bit what's going on in the last decades as well. Why so much fascination with glass in places where it's potentially not on, when just simply it's kind of almost sort of counterproductive and silly. The fascination with glass, the fascination with transparency, with fascination with change, transformation, self-sufficiently, and uttermost originality in our creative abilities comes together and characterizes very much the current state of affairs, I think, very well. Nevertheless, the synthesis remains a question mark. How can you do it? Through shortcuts. Another step has to follow. These are interesting examples. There's a restaurant, cafe restaurant in Berlin in 20s. There's Zaha, another piece from Zaha, the Japanese. Liebeskind, 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 The interesting thing is, and I'm probably not going to have time to talk much about that, but how eventually the reconciliation was seen much more part of the broader task. You cannot do it individually, you cannot do it just in a form of monologue. It has to be really dialogue. Only dialogue can really contribute to the bringing together closely, on bridging the gap and somehow coming to terms with the grey zone. Corp, in his Berstegi apartment, his conversion to top floor Berstegi apartment, creates kind of wonderful space, a solarium. The walls are about that height, so when you sit, you are in a room. When you stand, you sit in the city as a vista. The room is treated as a garden. There's a grass on the floor, but grass is treated as a carpet. The whole thing is solarium, so you expect just the sun to come in, and yet there's a fireplace. So it goes, so it goes. Eventually, deliberately, that's Corp, typical kind of installation. The fireplace is juxtaposed with the art itself. So the intimate is confronted with the monumental, and the monumental with the intimate. And the fire of the fireplace is related, of course, to the fire celebration of the war procession going through the Triumphal Arch, and so on and so forth. Opening that, and opening the ambiguity, of course, and dialogue is eventually the answer. Cubism has much to say about it. Surrealism has much to say about that. And some of the projects, I'm going to say only a few words about it. I may leave it for questions if there are any. There's a project in which we try to kind of see how the dialogue can be established in real terms, not just as a concept or as a piece of thinking, but as a thing that would have its own life on ground and in the reality as it is around us. Project in Spitalfield. This is the Spitalfield marketplace, which so much has been debated recently. City comes into it from the west, that's the tower, and the east end, Brick Lane, comes into it from the east. And this conflict, of course, is a typical one for so many other parts of London and the rest of Europe, probably, without. How you deal with the commercial kind of scene and how you deal with the civic scene. In order to avoid this sort of direct shortcuts, what has happened in this project is that the whole site was divided into three pieces. One, two, the central bit, untouched as a garden, sunken garden, as it is, down to the basement of the existing buildings. And it's left for negotiation. In other words, the future markets and all the complexity of the financial current world is built into that. And the civic requirements here, evening schools, the kind of department store, civic building, homeless people somewhere around here, etc., etc. Museum of Surrealism in East London next to it, and so on. The pieces that comes around in middle are negotiated in time. In other words, there are pieces which the city may support financially and have some interest in it, and yet would be of some value to the civic life of the city, the rest of the city. What are they? Well, a number of things like experimental theatre, the Center for Electronic Music, Center for Research into brain research related to computer viruses and related to psychiatric clinic that eventually has this sort of two sides as a result. So there are kind of negotiating, mediating links, steps which establish between those two monologues some form of dialogue. This appears also in the kind of drawings, how it's done. It's done in terms of respecting or kind of accepting the configuration, the abstract geometry of the whole thing, piece, the shadow theatre in this case. And in the background, you have the concreteness that does change, which is the shadow theatre itself is performed with light, silhouetting on the screens, movement, the audience is, moving dynamic and all that. So you get a certain concreteness, material, textures, light, people, events on one side, and the other kind of silent structure of the whole piece, which can be easily drawn in whatever sections and axa eventually. The juxtaposition of that creates a tension, deliberately so, because it serves as a catalyst to the steps that one can establish between them. So another look back towards the church in Spitalfields, and now in the middle, of course, is the sunken garden. Composite drawings of the problem. So this is a Surrealist museum. And the Surrealist museum is made out of pieces. The exhibits are on one half of it. The second half is treated as a metal plating workshop. Metal plating is a piece of alchemy and magic. electrolytic transformation of metal from one end to another, and you can cover any kind of metal. It's a wonderful process still used today. So the alchemy of the surrealist imagination and poetry is on the other side, and they share a territory common, which is for the meeting sessions, libraries, etc., etc., etc. So it's a kind of dialogue again established even in the layout of the museum itself. Experimental music. The experimental music, probably I should show you the bed here, sorry. This is the experimental music thing, which ends up in the aviary, and the window is basically aviary with sort of birds in it and so forth. A great deal of modern music has been influenced by sounds coming from nature and so on. And that's what you see in the window of the experimental space. Experimental music space, this is the window. You can close it, but you can also keep it open to the garden and combine the music with the sounds and use it for recording, God knows what. A lot of things can happen there. I probably should almost stop here. This is another project in Prague. I'll just show you some of the drawings come out of it. It's all based on the kind of dialogical struggle between what the structures may be, what the engineering side of things could contribute to, and current technological possibilities, with the conditions that are not answered in the engineering framework. Just to give you one example, probably, this is a preparatory study for a cabaret, how you design a cabaret. Cabaret is a nightclub, is a cafe, is a bit of a theater, but none of that. It's not either or. It's something special. Cabaret is always something different. So what you may do is start working with kind of metaphorical images, fragments of each of those, trying to see them, how they relate, what are the similarities, affinities, and so on. And gradually, you're creating a space out of it, which will be more, and I'm saying just very carefully, not identical, but more successful in terms of saying something about cabaret. And some of the kind of drawings eventually can be then done with straightforward simulation media. Right. My point that I was trying to make is that the business of Crossroad illustrates also the dilemma that we're facing as designers between production and creativity. The possibility of purely technical approaches and engineering as a discipline would tell us quite a lot about what can be produced. So production and inventiveness in the thermometer sense, there's no limit to it. We can have as much of it as is available around in those disciplines. But the question is it all also creative? And that's where I would make a distinction between pure production and creativity. Creativity is the degree of reconciliation with what is already here, the conditions that I mentioned before. And to that extent that we succeed, to that extent we are truly creative. Otherwise, it's a production. And the production has, of course, the dangers I was mentioning. If you go into production in one way, either referring to something very elementary, disregarding, the whole body of memory that we have, culture, basic culture at least, as it appearing in language and whatever we inherited, we have it, cannot get rid of it. To the extent that you ignore that, you're moving into the territory of primitivism. And the primitivism appears in places where we would not expect it. Eisenman operation is totally primitive from end to end, with little shines occasionally of reference to something which would have to do with memory, because you cannot get completely rid of it. But its intention is definitely primitive. The attempt, on the other hand, to go to the kind of elementary forces, private personal experiences, returning so-called to nature, typical statement, is primitive too. The problem is in the middle, and that's more or less the message that I want to deliver. Question, if any? Thank you. we speak loudly, they'll be fine.
Yeah. Did you ever want to build anything? Did you ever want to design a building yourself?
Well, I'm working very closely with Eric Parry, and part of that is there. I was also working in recent past a number of things with Danny Libeskind. So those are the kind of areas when you can afford to go for a few days or weeks, but otherwise, you know, the teaching is sort of either or. You cannot do too many things extra. But probably now that they're closing the school, will be the time just to push it a little bit that direction. Yes, I did build quite a bit, but not in this country. It was in France, in Prague. And very much interiors, theater, stage, sets, and things like that. Yeah. But other people, you know, in a similar kind of direction. I'm talking about Steve Hall and Danny, obviously, quite a bit, and certainly Eric Parry and so on. You know, there's a number of people that I would have absolutely no kind of feeling of distance, as it were. You know, it's not really what I'm presenting is not certainly then my own thing. It's sort of a result of a group of people, collaboration, and so on. And it happens both in the studio, drawing boards, but it happens also more and more in the offices as well. I feel, you know, very, very positive about that, regardless that I was not directly involved at all when somebody like you know, Howard does the Royal Court Theatre, and what happens there, it's pretty rewarding. I would mention Moisen and Homa, but they may not agree with me, so I rather silent about it, because they want to have it their own way, I suppose. That's one of the, you know, tricky thing to answer such a question, because, you know, there's a lot of layers, and you know, we do what we do, and open, as it were, the gates of reference and horizon. But there's a kind of inevitable tendency nowadays to which even people who don't want to go that way are pushed, that you have to, in the end, show, you know, your signature. And that's really a bit of a dilemma, that architecture, particularly on a larger scale, cannot be very much a result of blueprinting or master plans. You know, it used to be, and it's by its very nature, a result of a certain degree of collaboration. But the collaboration is a very uncomfortable notion for us today. And you can see it when you look around the scene across the world and say, are there any movements? Probably not. Are there any groups? Very few, if any. They're just individuals. That's the current state of affairs. You know, 10, 20 years ago, there was still something like New York 5. Well, they didn't last very long. Movements, well, Cubism, Surrealism, Brutalism, those are names. You know, as you go close to our time, they become just empty names. You cannot, you know, see people really supporting it. If you go back to the Art Nouveau period, that's probably not only movement, but even you can say that's an epoch. Romanticism is certainly an epoch. So it goes. But as you go back to our time, the epochs, movements, eventually groups, eventually individuals. That's really the line so far. And therefore, the collaborations and so on, even in terms of kind of individual names, is very questionable. The paradox can be expressed in one sentence. Everybody who's doing competition trying to see or know that the other people are doing something different, that you're doing something they don't do, so it's original. So as original as possible, ultimately individual. But if you do get the first prize, the next day it's published everywhere, and you believe that everybody would just simply say, well, I always thought so, you know, that's what I think. So it's suddenly private, and next day it's universal. How you square it? Interesting question. That's where we are. I mean, you know, all the people who have their own signature and cultivate it, they certainly do simultaneously two things. Those that I mentioned. They want to be absolutely unique. I mean, I remember, you know, the recent conversation with Danny says, well, people think that I'm very close to Gary and I like him a lot, but I hope I'm not like him. Well, fair enough, you know, so you're academic to your style, your way of thinking. And yet, when it comes to something so provocative like the ground zero, millions of people talking into it, writing and believing that it should be their values. And, in his presentation he would say, I'm speaking for a particular period of America as a whole, culture as a whole. Ergo, there is a universality there. So I think that dilemma is also interesting characteristic of our situation. There are not clear answers. We have a number of issues, probably some of the more important ones, that they have no answer. They're just dilemmas. They're collisions. You can't have it both ways, either or. And yet, we're still trying somehow to square it. But probably time will tell that it's a waste of time and we have to operate on a different level. And if you're really talking about universality, just take it seriously, not just in words. So that's basically where we are.
I wonder if I could ask you about scale. I've often felt that many of the most problematic phenomena in architecture around us are to do with not the disappearance of the human scale in some sort of humanistic way to do with the size of the human body, but rather the continuous upscaling of detail and thinking of a progression that one could observe from, let's say, the degree of a piece of rocaille in the mid-18th century, where it's a detail of an object, to the Jugendstil, where the curve becomes the entire articulation of an interior, and now to the work of Gehry and others, in which the same curvature is upscaled to a kind of megastructure. And this seems to me a phenomenon to notice that could be as a sort of a parallel phenomenon to, say, Rem Koolhaas's observations about very, very large scale.
I think the scale actually become deliberately obscured and deliberately negated. The scales are something which is not seen as important. I think people, particularly Gehry and so on, they operate on a level of sculpture, which is an object, and it's almost an object tangible in front of you and so on. But how much of that, you take a fish and make it into a Japanese fish restaurant, and the fish is still in front of it somewhere. And yet you don't have a scale. I mean, when you look at the building, depends how far how you can measure your position. You say, oh, I see it's the whole building, and it's quite big actually when you come close to it. But the scale doesn't seem to have any particular. I think the ambiguity of scale is almost intentional and deliberate. And it seems to me, just part of much more fundamental kind of ambiguities that are here, in terms of what is object, what is space, what is building, what is sculpture, does it matter? And it goes way back. I remember at this place again, Jim Sterling was giving a lecture, and at the end of it somebody says, is there any difference in your view between your building and industrial design? To which Sterling says, no, I don't see any difference. They're the same. So again, scale, isn't it? Because usually industrial design has to do with things like cars, and ships are all the interiors and so on. But mostly we're talking about consumers' objects. So the scale is very ambiguous. I think that one cannot make much out of it. And it's part of the deeper game, much deeper than that. Scales are secondary issues. It's much more to do with the unification of all the tasks in some kind of universal design problem. That's what seems to be taking place.
Last question there.
I wonder if you could tell us about your experience of communicating with students in your design studio. How does that flourish or work and come to the images that you shoot?
Because I've been practically my whole life teaching diploma, so it's sort of last stage towards the real world, so to speak. People would be, mature and so on, and it's almost like a team working on a competition, actually. It's a kind of collaboration rather. And the collaboration is sort of a reciprocity. I mean, I have some role in it, but it's up to a point, then it starts moving both directions. And particularly the kind of projects we have been doing were very often, I would say more often than not, oriented towards scale of urbanity of some sort. If you're working on that scale, it's always issue, how individually much you can do. And so most of the projects were done as individual project, but in between themselves, not just between me and the student, but between the students themselves, as collaboration. In other words, the piece, like say, I was showing you the Spitalfields, it's about what, 220 by 110 meters size, and that was a site on which something like 7, 8, 9 people, I think, been working. So each individual pieces, and at some stage it starts coming together and negotiating, how it can be related, which is a very creative moment as well. But the thing is considered by everybody at the beginning, and then certain agreement about the primary thing, no more. This is the primary thing that we agree about the basic topography where things go through. And then it goes into the individual stage where everybody went, but people collaborate in terms of seeing each other there, and then eventually trying to see how it all can eventually create the piece as a whole. So there is a kind of collaboration, and I would call it probably communicative, definitely. A lot of communication, different levels. People talk, people silently draw, and just models and think whatever, and computers possibilities. So the communication of kind of in reciprocity actually, and I'm somewhere in it, but not as a kind of those in front of the scene. I'm just sort of traveling around, involved in different ways. Short of producing drawings,